My name's Mike Brown, and I'm the TNS UK Digital Operations Director.
And you've got a double act with me. I'm Mark Fisher. I've got a slightly different role. I'm in a client service role at TNS as an account director for one of our global accounts. Anyway, in the next 15 minutes or so, Mike and I are going to be talking to you about how the increasingly connected mobile world is affecting the way that both of us in our quite different roles are working, but really focusing on survey research, as that's really at the heart of what we still do at TNS.
And really illustrating that difference and what it means to us and also to the consumers who make key decisions that influence our clients' businesses. And we're doing this by adopting a sort of more clever, what we're calling clever or more pragmatic approach to survey design. Selecting the right data capture platforms that suit really a consumer's life, so really getting into the context of that moment. And then a thorough re-evaluation of sample sources.
Cool. So we have to keep on handing this back and back.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll start with some reality and something that I think most of you will be really familiar with. It's certainly been mentioned a few times already in this conference to do with interview length specifically, or chicken pies. I think we're all starting to refer to that. And that reality is that we all too often still, when we are receiving briefs or writing briefs, see requests for some real specific things. So things like a 30-minute interview length, for example, that's done online, perhaps even specified via mobile phone to X number of people in whatever countries. And some of us might be writing those briefs, perhaps for good reasons. Some of us will be receiving those. And of course, we should be questioning those and challenging them. But what we want to demonstrate this morning is that we all really should be thinking about the business issues that are behind those briefs. And for us at TNS, this is the different, that is now the new normal for us. So we really start thinking about that business issue and thinking about what insight about people is required to address that business issue, and insight about people that we need to know. So we then think about the people in that context, and then have to think about to what extent we have to, or indeed can, understand the context about people at that particular point of time, and think about who it is we're talking to, where in the world they are, what market it is, and that form of context of geography as well.
I may have found a second.
I
may have found a second one. It works as well. Excellent. And context, really, describing it from an advertising perspective. Lewis Eller, who was presenting earlier this morning, really had a great example of the sort of personalisation of advertising. Really understanding the location and time that the advertising is taking place is really important. It'll affect the consumer's response to any questions we deliver. And then thinking of the actual channel, the media channel that the advertising may be pushed through, and what surrounds that. That will all influence what feedback we get from respondents. And of course, that's nothing new. I mean, we've known for years that the medium, to some extent, is equally as important as the message. And when it comes to research, place and time are vital to us as well. And that's been demonstrated over yesterday and earlier today in discussing how people are reacting to various stimulus. So when we've decided that context is important, how do we actually go about designing our work? Well, in categories like out-of-home usage and consumption, or where semi-conscious behaviour is part of the decision, part of the respondent's process, you've only got to think about the stuff that's actually got to be in the moment. You've really got to get very close to that moment. And historically, we have struggled as an industry to get very close to that moment of decision making. Mobile has now enabled us to get closer to that moment. However, it isn't actually everyone's need. It's not important on every occasion. If you've got a particularly long purchase cycle, getting close to that moment isn't necessarily the absolute be-all and end-all. And then when it comes down to designing our surveys, we've got the difference between, say, mobile and an agnostic approach. And agnostic was a word that was used yesterday. Our definition of it is slightly different. We would use the term agnostic, where you're delivering a survey across platforms that work across platforms, but you're not adapting that survey in any way across different devices. So I think the example yesterday was showing how concepts were delivered through a touchscreen compared to a PC. When we're talking about agnostic, we're talking about delivering them in the same way. An adaptive or optimized survey would then look to change the way that was actually working for a respondent, and actually work in a different way and possibly present the questions and ask questions in a different way. However, if mobile is at the core of your thinking, you've really got to think about how you're going to design those things and take that into account.
And of course, running through all of this is the actual survey design itself. And the number of times it's been mentioned in the last couple of days, I think we can see just how important it is at the moment. And in my view, it's definitely something we need to appreciate. There's both an art and a science to good survey design. And with more and more respondents completing surveys on smaller screens, on mobile phones, we really need to focus on asking just the most important and the most relevant things in our questions. And one really simple example of that is just the wording of questions itself and making them as short as possible. And the example that's on the screen at the moment is probably a type of question that most of you will be familiar with. And if we really ask ourselves, is this really as short as it could be? And of course it's not. And when we think about shortening it, there's certain ways to do it. Perhaps we could shave off the now and the please, make it slightly less polite. That will take it down a little bit. And is the word indicate, is that really the type of language that normal people will use? That'll take it down a little bit more. But in my view, if we really strip it down to the bare bones and we think a little bit differently, rather than kind of copying and pasting from the last time, we can get it down to being, there we go, just forward. So have you heard of? And of course that then leaves plenty of room for brand logos and so on for respondents to interact with, whether that's dragging and dropping or selecting, whatever way, the most interactive way that you can do in your business. Now, is this really a giant leap forward in our industry, or is it just kind of going back to best practice in survey design? Well, I'll leave you to think about that for your own businesses. But one of the observations I've made with working with lots of different companies is that within this industry, for whatever reason, we really seem to struggle to think differently and not just kind of copy and paste from the last project we did. And that's something that we certainly need to address in this industry, and quite quickly.
And really going back to that term moment, used in popular phrases like close to the moment and in the moment, it's popular across advertising, marketing and research itself. And to me, it's really beginning to sound like a movie franchise. So I'm going to lay claim to a couple of future versions. I'm going to lay claim to In the Moment 2, which is a bit like a diary study, because you go back to the same people a number of times. And the other one I'm going to lay claim to is Before the Moment, the prequel, which we actually do with our predictive equity modelling. So we actually know what's going to happen before it actually happens. But to demonstrate how we get close to that moment, here's a study that was conducted in the UK on snacking. And as you can see from the figures here, we conducted it over 3 weeks. Each respondent was asked between 9 a.m. in the morning and 3 a.m. the next morning to record their snacking consumption. And over a quarter of the responses we got were within 1 hour of the actual snacking consumption. If you move that on to later in the day, just to refer to that, so if you look at the numbers, that's over 3,000 snacking occasions you're working with as data points. If you move into later in the day, we got it up to 60% of the responses were received within 1 hour of sort of dinner, late evening time. And this would be compared against something like a normal or traditional approach that would be taken, where you'd be getting recall within the last 24 hours, where you're really can be quite distant from the actual snacking consumption.
Okay. So just to give you a real-life kind of client example of a business issue where it's really important to be in the moment, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about a case study, an example of a project that we did in the UK. for a drinks client, where we were collecting data using a mobile app. And the app in this example allowed us to time the research to a very specific moment in time, the moment, the context that was really important for the client in this instance. And that time frame was when people are watching Championship League football fixtures, or Champions League football fixtures. And more than that, the app also allowed us to be less reliant on people remembering what they did, what they were drinking, what they were doing when they were completing this survey. And of course, in a category like drinks, when people are watching football, if we're all honest, a lot of us like to have an alcoholic drink or two when we're watching sports. It means that it's even more important to not be reliant on people remembering the next morning what they did the night before. And kind of another advantage that doing survey research in the moment also allows us to do in this data collection method is it means that the data also becomes available to clients the very next day, which is great news for clients. But of course, we learnt a couple of things along the way as we were doing this example. And one of which was we really shouldn't just assume because someone is able to conduct the survey on a mobile and able to be out of home, so in a pub, for example, watching the football, doesn't necessarily mean that that's what they'll be doing. The vast majority of our respondents in this case study they're sitting at home in front of their TV watching the football. The app also allowed us to ask respondents to take photographs, and I know that yesterday we saw some examples of that as well, but we really did learn a couple of things from the way that we did that. It's great to land insight with clients and bring things to life, but you've really got to be very specific in exactly what you ask respondents to take photographs of. So we ended up with a whole bunch of just glasses of light-coloured liquid, which really could have been anything and weren't that useful at all. So it would have been much, much better if we'd asked respondents to take pictures of a brand logo, for example, and then that would have been much, much more useful for us. So just to summarise the main kind of advantages to clients of using in-the-moment research, is we end up with much closer proximity to the experience. Basically, people can find it easier to, or not reliant on remembering what it was they did. We get much more detail and granularity on the context, so the who, the where, the what, and that can be done on a kind of occasion-by-occasion basis and then linked the behavioural data to the attitudinal data as well, which is great. And both of those things combined means we get much better data, much more valid data that can be delivered much faster to clients as well.
So when you've decided that getting data in the moment is really important, then one you've got to consider is whether you need a multi-occasion approach or a single occasion approach. And we've seen a lot of requests for diary studies at the moment, but that doesn't necessarily be an absolute necessity. It doesn't necessarily suit the business need. When you need that multiple entry approach is in examples of perhaps low populations, really difficult sample groups, so something like physicians where you need to go back to a small population. Or an area like where the event at stage 1 will affect a choice at stage 3, so you need that connection over time from an individual so you can really understand the impact. An example of that would be something like the oral care category. Now that's very routine based and it spreads across a day. In fact, thinking about it here, across something like a conference, that could influence people's oral care habits. But in a number of cases, you don't need to go back to the same respondent again and again. And the advantages of that is certainly it can be much more efficient as a process. You can increase response rates. It can be more cost effective. Certainly one of the challenges we're seeing is that the assumption is that by getting more people, that will raise costs. That isn't always the case, depending on how you sample. And the other thing is it's less of a burden on the actual person. You only need them for that one occasion, so it's a better experience for them. Now, so far, we've been focusing on the examples that we're talking about the UK, and its studies taken via an app or mobile internet. But of course, when you add geography to it, crossing borders, looking at a global approach, you can't just assume that everyone will have access to the same device. And certainly in terms of when you need to get closer to that consumer choice, using mobile, you have to consider what platform you're going to use. So we need to find a way of connecting with people in places where computer or internet access is low, but mobile phone usage is high. Mobile is actually allowing us to access areas of the country that previously is actually really hard to reach. Perhaps you can try and put interviews there, but for various reasons it can be either very costly or it can be really difficult to do for safety reasons. And the new normal for our clients is certainly a pressure on research budgets, so cost is always a key factor in some of the decisions we're making. So any options that mobile can help in reducing those costs are greatly appreciated from us and our clients. So thinking really on a global scale, I'm going to pick a market like Nigeria. Now we've seen some data yesterday on mobile internet access and smartphone uptake. So smartphones certainly are on rapid increase in emerging and developing markets. But in a market like Nigeria, over 100 million people still use a feature phone, and that's their main device for connecting to the internet. It also may not even connect to the internet, so the device itself may have the capability to connect, but through barriers like cost, the person actually can't afford to go online. And some of the discussion that Dalia were talking about and how you might incentivise people to take part is you can give them access to online. But it really doesn't democratise the whole market. There may be a lot of mobile phones, but it doesn't give everyone access to your survey tools. The GSMA have predicted that half of the world's adult population by 2020 will have access to mobile internet. The flip side of that is, well, 3.5 billion people won't have access to the internet via a mobile device in just over 4 years' time. And we need to reach those people because our clients need to get access to them. And even when you look at areas like, say, smartphone uptake in Nigeria, the current wave of smartphones, perhaps in the UK, where you're seeing the likes of the iPhone 6 and the newer version 6S, the Samsung Galaxy devices that are sort of the 5-6 inch type devices, that's not common in Nigeria. In Nigeria, 4-inch devices, which are the more traditional iPhone 4 screens for those of you who had them, that would be common in the newer phones reaching the market. Again, the newer phones reaching the market. So today, what's available, we need to consider things like screen real estate.
So I'll illustrate that with a really cool example of a project that we did in 8 African countries in a lot so cool category. So it was on cooking seasonings, that's things like kind of powders and spices and that kind of thing. Anyway, in this example, we contacted a really broad sample of respondents using text messages. And if we'd used a classic data collection method, we would have got a kind of an average of what people were using, how they were cooking, and with what and what they thought over a period of time. But using the text message technique to collect the data allowed us to contact a very broad sample of people and work out exactly what they were doing, how they were cooking on lots of different types of cooking occasions. So what they were doing in the morning, at lunchtime, and evening, and of course over the course of a week or so as well, so you can see what's happening on different days. An example of one of the things that kind of came out of that research is that we found out that 9 out of 10 cooking occasions, people were able to use the product that they want to use, so their favorite product. But what was really interesting for our client in that example was the 10% of cooking occasions where people weren't able to use their preferred product, and really understanding for those specific occasions what the barriers were to using the product that they'd like to use.
And now moving to more of a smartphone-centric population, again thinking of like markets like the UK and US. We're certainly connected with the internet, we certainly have access to apps. And the way we actually connect with them in terms of surveys can be in an active way, by actually serving the survey, or we can collect passive data, whether that be by something installed on the phone or by social media content. It's also important to consider the Internet of Things that was mentioned at one of the talks yesterday. as that is beginning to show us where data can really connect people's lives. So having got through the design and having worked out exactly what you need to put in your survey, you've hit the right devices, or you think you're designing for the right devices. How are we actually going to get the respondents? Well, to start with, it's important to consider the mobile internet. The figures I was talking about earlier. There's a huge amount of people globally who can actually access the mobile internet. It's a big tick in the box for mobile. And then if you add text messaging in the example Mark was talking about, that's really broadening your reach. So you're really beginning to get quite large volumes of people within countries. And it's also accessing areas where it's been, I say, traditionally difficult to get to. Adding to that the out-of-home capability, and you're really in a win-win situation with mobile. So that's kind of nailed it. We really need mobile. I think everyone here appreciates it, and all the stuff you've seen so far is really accessing those things. But still, where do we actually find those people? Well, finally, this is where things are definitely different for us now. We can utilise things like consumer access panels that have been in existence for really approaching 20 years now. And a number of those are converting some of their panellists to mobile, and even new mobile panels are springing up. There's also the group of River or Intercept, where someone will be taking an activity online or using an app, and we will feed them through to one of our surveys. Important to bear in mind here is because of that activity, it's very likely you're looking at a transient population. So someone will come to your survey once, but don't necessarily think you can get back to that same person. And then finally, subscriber databases. And this is a key area for us globally now at TNS. As an example, working with Geopol, we can reach huge audiences in sub-Saharan Africa. The previous speaker was talking about the 750,000 in New Zealand, which I was just trying to work out what that was. It's probably, I'm guessing, over 50% of the population. Well, certainly in some of the sub-Saharan markets, we can reach even beyond that because we've got access through subscriber databases which are working with mobile networks. And that's enabling us to find out that we can get access to people who aren't really immediately interested in surveys themselves. So the concern there initially for us was looking at the data, what type of data would we get? And what we found when comparing to more normal approaches is actually the data's really solid. And then in areas like where you're beginning to get sensitive questions that are quite often important for our social and political clients, mobile is really helping through the subscriber databases. We ran a question asking people how often you actually go without food, which is when you're putting, say, interviewers out in the field, people will want to sort of make themselves feel a bit more better and make the interviewer feel that they're the sort of a person who doesn't have to worry about that. Well, we found by using mobile, we got the responses to the I go without food often or regularly. The numbers were much higher and much more supporting the evidence that we believe is in the population.
So just to sum up real quick, I hope we've given you an indication of how the increasingly mobile world is allowing us to answer our clients' business challenges in a slightly different way, how we're adding context more and more into our surveys and giving you a flavour of the kind of the way that we're designing our research differently, kind of using these kind of three broad areas that we've been talking about. And I really hope that for you too that different becomes the new normal. Thank you.